The morning of May 30th, 1431 dawned cold over Rouen. In the marketplace, executioner Geoffroy Terrage built a pyre higher than usual, elevated so the crowd could get a good view. He'd burned heretics before, but his hands trembled slightly. This was no ordinary heretic. In Bouvreuil Castle, a 19-year-old girl knelt on stone, praying. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. The guards shifted uncomfortably. For months they'd watched this strange girl who'd commanded armies, crowned a king, claimed to speak with saints. Now she was just a frightened teenager, head shorn, wrists marked by chains. They'll tell you it's about miracles and martyrdom, sure, but it's also about how pure faith gets weaponized by political machinery. About a teenage girl whose divine mission required brutal warfare, making her both saint and warlord. A divine solution that became a political problem. To understand the betrayal that led to those flames, you need to understand the miracle that preceded it, the desperate kingdom that needed her, the village girl who chose, and it was a choice, to answer a call that would save a nation and seal her doom. While others sleep soundly, I dig through the archives and read you the parts they skipped in school. Subscribe if you're tired of fairy tales, and if you can, let me know where you're listening from. Now, take a slow, deep breath, settle into your cozier spot, and let the modern world fade away as I take you back to a France that barely existed. English soldiers in Paris, brigands on the roads, and a teenage girl hearing voices that would change everything. The France that Jeanne d'Arc was born into in 1412 was a carcass being picked clean. The 100 Years' War had ground on for 3 generations, leaving a kingdom where English soldiers held Paris itself, where the Duke of Burgundy had betrayed his own nation for power, and where the Dauphin Charles, not even properly crowned, cowered in the south while his own mother declared him a bastard. This was less a country than a wound that wouldn't heal, where mothers taught daughters to hide when horses approached because it didn't matter whose colours the riders wore. Domremy sat on the edge of this chaos, a small village on the eastern frontier, technically loyal to the Dauphin but surrounded by Burgundian territory. It was the kind of place history forgets, a cluster of houses along the Meuse River, a stone church, fields of barley and rye stretching toward dark forests where wolves still hunted. The air smelled of wood smoke and cattle, of tilled earth and the ever-present dampness of the river. It was a hard life, but a simple one. If you could ignore the war parties that occasionally swept through, the taxes that grew heavier each year, the news of battles lost and territories fallen, Jeanne's family, the D'Arcs, were what passed for prosperous in such a place. Her father owned his own land, not much, but enough to make him a man of substance in the village. Their house was stone, not timber, with a proper hearth and glazed windows, luxuries most of their neighbours couldn't afford. They had livestock, cattle, pigs, chickens scratching in the yard. In the mornings, the house filled with the smell of baking bread, the sound of her mother Isabel's spinning wheel, the comfortable chaos of a working household. Jeanne was the 4th of 5 children, a middle child in every sense. Her older brothers, Jacquemin and Jean, worked the fields with their father. Her sister Catherine had married and moved to a neighbouring village. Her younger brother Pierre still played in the dust of the dooryard. And Jeanne? Jeanne helped her mother with the endless women's work. Spinning, weaving, cooking, tending the kitchen garden where cabbages grew in neat rows and herbs perfumed the air. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary village girl. She couldn't read or write. Few could in such places. She knew her prayers in Latin by rote, the words worn smooth as river stones by repetition. She was pious, yes, perhaps more than most. The village priest noted how she lingered in the church after Mass, kneeling before the painted wooden statue of the Virgin, her lips moving in silent conversation. But in a world where death came easy and often, where plague might sweep through any summer, where soldiers might arrive any dawn, Piety was common as bread. And then, when she was 13, something changed. She was in her father's garden when the first voice came. Summer, past noon, the sun high and hot, the scent of roses mixing with turned earth. The voice came from her right, from the direction of the church, accompanied by a light that seemed to come from within brightness itself. Terror first, then wonder, as she understood. This was St. Michael, the archangel. Soon he was joined by others. St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Margaret of Antioch, virgin martyrs both. To Jean they were as real as the kitchen table. They were beautiful, wore rich crowns, smelled of paradise. Sometimes she embraced them, felt their warmth. For 3 years the voices guided her gently. Be good, go to church, live righteously. Then their message changed, becoming impossible to ignore or obey. She must go to the Dauphin. She must raise the siege of Orléans. She must see him crowned at Rheims. She must drive the English from France. A 16-year-old peasant girl who'd never held a weapon heavier than a kitchen knife was to save France. The pressure became unbearable, the commands urgent. By her 16th year, she could resist no longer. Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs, laughed when she first appeared at his gates in May of 1428. He told her uncle to take her home and box her ears, but Jean returned in January making a prophecy. The Dauphin's forces would suffer a terrible defeat that very day near Orléans. When news of the Battle of the Herrings arrived days later, confirming her vision, something shifted in Baudricourt's pragmatic mind. She'd known. Somehow this illiterate farm girl had known. He gave her what she needed, a horse, an escort of 6 men, and crucially, permission to dress as a soldier. The transformation was remarkable. The hesitant farm girl vanished, replaced by something harder to define. The 11-day journey to Chinon through enemy territory passed in a blur of night rides and narrow escapes. Her escorts later swearing they felt toward her as toward a sister, protected by something beyond the natural. They reached Chinon on March 4th, 1429. The great fortress loomed above the town, its towers catching the last light of winter afternoon. Somewhere behind those walls waited the Dauphin Charles, uncrowned, uncertain, the man whose own mother had declared him a bastard. The man Jeanne's voices insisted was the true king of France. The meeting that followed would become the stuff of legend. Charles, paranoid and testing as always, hid himself among his courtiers. He dressed another in royal robes, seated him prominently, surrounded him with the trappings of power. It was a test, of course. If this peasant girl was what she claimed, surely her divine guides would reveal the trick. The great hall of Chinon was packed that evening. Torches flickered in iron brackets, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and too many unwashed bodies pressed together. Nobles in silk and velvet, knights in mail, servants and soldiers and hangers-on, all craning to see the miracle girl from Domremy. Jean entered alone, still in her soldier's clothes, looking impossibly small amid the grandeur. She should have been overwhelmed. Any normal person would have been. The sheer weight of expectation, the hostility of nobles who saw her as either a fraud or a threat, the magnitude of what she was attempting, it should have crushed her. Instead, witnesses reported she walked through that crowd like Moses through the Red Sea, straight past the false Dauphin on his borrowed throne, through the press of courtiers, directly to a man standing in the shadows, trying to blend with his own court. She knew him, without introduction, without hesitation. She knew him. She knelt before Charles, thin, nervous Charles with his long nose and worried eyes, and spoke words that multiple witnesses recorded, though none could agree on the exact phrasing. The essence was always the same. She had come, sent by God, to see him crowned and to save his kingdom. Charles remained sceptical. Of course he did. His entire life had been one long lesson in betrayal and disappointment, but he granted her a private audience, there in a window alcove away from the crowd. What she said to him in that moment, what secret she revealed, has never been fully explained. Jean took it to her grave, or rather to her pyre. Charles never spoke of it directly, but those close to him reported the change. He emerged from that brief conference radiant, one said. As if a great weight had been lifted, said another. The most credible accounts suggest she told him of a private prayer he'd made months earlier, alone in his chapel. A desperate prayer in which he'd begged God for a sign. If he was the rightful king, let him serve France. If he was not, let him suffer alone without dragging the kingdom down with him. She knew about the prayer. She knew its exact words. She knew things only Charles and God could know. Before Charles could risk his fragile credibility on this unlikely saviour, she had to be tested. In Poitiers, theologians examined her faith for 3 weeks. When they asked what language her voices spoke, she replied they spoke better French than the examiner. A sly dig at his Limousin accent, they found nothing heretical. More crucial was the physical examination. The Dauphin's mother-in-law assembled noble women to verify her virginity. Not prurience, but politics. An old prophecy claimed the kingdom lost by a woman would be saved by a virgin. She was intact, La Pucelle, the maid. By April of 1429, the machinery of state swung into motion. This peasant girl who'd arrived at Chinon in borrowed clothes was fitted with armour, specially made, white-painted for visibility. She was given a military household, seasoned advisors, and most remarkably, an army. 4,000 men, united only by desperation and wild hope that maybe this strange girl really did carry God's favour. The test would come at Orléans. The English had held the city under siege for 6 months, slowly strangling it. Their fortresses formed a ring of stone and steel around the city. The French had tried to break the siege before and failed bloodily. Now they were trying again, with a teenage girl at their head. Jean entered Orléans on April 29th, 1429, riding a white horse, her banner held high. The city went mad with joy. Here was their deliverer, their miracle, their proof that God had not abandoned France. Crowds pressed close, trying to touch her, to catch a blessing. Torches and candles turned the night to day. Church bells rang until the air itself seemed to vibrate with celebration. But celebration doesn't win sieges. The real test was yet to come. On May 7th, the French attacked the English fortress of Les Tourelles, the key to the entire siege. It was a brutal affair. Scaling ladders against stone walls, crossbow bolts falling like lethal rain, the chaos of battle filling the air. Jean was everywhere, her white armour making her a target, her banner drawing French soldiers forward and English aim alike. Then it happened. An English projectile struck her during the assault, finding a vulnerable spot in her armour. Witnesses saw her fall, saw crimson staining her white armour. They carried her from the field. This girl who claimed divine protection, grievously wounded. She cried. Of course she cried. She was 17 years old, felled in battle. The injury was serious, potentially fatal. Many had died from less. A soldier offered to heal her with charms, the kind of folk magic every army knew. She refused, calling it sin. They tended to her wound while she prayed through the ordeal, treating it with olive oil and lard. She wept. She was in that moment utterly human. And then she did something that transformed her from symbol to legend. She returned to the battle, not the next day, not when the wound had healed. That very evening, as the sun was setting and the French attack was faltering, she appeared again at the foot of the walls. The white armour was dented now, stained with blood, her blood, but she carried her banner high, and when the French soldiers saw her, saw the girl they'd thought dead or dying standing before them, something broke inside them. Not their courage, their doubt. They surged forward with the kind of desperate fury that only comes when men believe heaven itself fights beside them. The English, who'd been celebrating her wounding, saw her rise like something out of their worst nightmares. The witch they'd mocked, seemingly impervious to mortal weapons. Their defence crumbled. Betrayal fell. By May 8th, the English were in full retreat, abandoning the siege that had seemed unbreakable. Orléans was free. The girl had done it. The miracle was real. The coronation campaign that followed was a military masterpiece. In 6 weeks, the French army marched through hostile territory, sweeping aside resistance, gathering strength. On July 17th, 1429, in the ancient cathedral of Reims, Charles VII was crowned King of France. Jeanne stood beside him, holding her banner. The banner that had been through the toil, she said, deserved to share the honour. But even as the sacred oil touched Charles's forehead, even as the crowds cheered and the bells rang, the machinery that had elevated her was already calculating her disposal. She had served her purpose. The king had his crown. What need did he have now for miracles? She couldn't see it yet. How could she? She stood in that cathedral, barely 18 years old, having accomplished everything her voices had demanded. The logical next step in her divinely inspired mind was clear. Press on. Drive the English from every inch of French soil. Complete the mission God had given her. She didn't understand that politics has no room for absolutes, that the men who'd used her divine certainty to crown a king now needed the flexibility to negotiate, to compromise, to play the long game of diplomacy. She didn't understand that miracles by their very nature are temporary, useful for changing the game, dangerous when the game needs to return to normal. The girl who'd been touched by heaven was about to learn the oldest truth of power. The machine that lifts you up is the same machine that grinds you down. She'd given them their miracle. Now she was about to become their problem. In Rouen, 2 years later, the executioner would check his pyre one more time, making sure the wood was dry, the platform high enough for all to see. The machine knew how to handle problems. It had had plenty of practice. The crown had barely settled on Charles VII's freshly anointed head when the problems began. You could see it in the way his advisor's smiles tightened when Jeanne spoke of the next campaign. The girl who'd given him his throne was already becoming an embarrassment. The feast at Reims was a glittering affair, as glittering as a bankrupt kingdom could manage. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and sugared subtleties. Wines flowed like the Seine in spring flood. Lords who'd been hedging their bets for years suddenly discovered they'd been loyal to Charles all along. The hall rang with toasts and laughter, the desperate gaiety of men who couldn't quite believe their good fortune. Jeanne sat at the high table, still in her armour. She rarely took it off anymore, as if steel had become her skin. She looked out of place among the silk-clad nobles, like a sword at a sewing circle. She didn't touch the wine, barely picked at the food. Her eyes kept drifting to the great doors, as if she could see through them to the roads beyond, to the English forces still holding French soil. 3 days after the coronation, the clash came. Jeanne had requested an audience with the king. Requested, mind you, like any common petitioner, she who'd placed the crown on his head. She laid out her plan with the same certainty that had carried her from Domremy to Reims. March on Paris immediately. Strike while the English were reeling. Her voices were clear. God wanted the capital restored. But the newly crowned king and his advisors had discovered the pleasures of diplomacy. They whispered of negotiation with Burgundy, of peace without further bloodshed. If Philip the Good could be turned from his English alliance, the war might end without another battle. It was cleaner than letting a peasant girl continue her holy crusade. The march toward Paris that followed was a masterpiece of reluctance. Every village became an excuse to stop, every crossroads a reason to reconsider. Messages flew between the French court and Burgundy, while Jeanne chafed like a warhorse forced to pull a plough. Her frustration emerged in ways that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. During the siege of a minor town, she dictated a letter to the Hussites, those Czech heretics who dared to question church doctrine. The language she used would have made a Grand Inquisitor proud. She called them worse than Saracens, threatened to abandon the English war to come and deal with them personally if they didn't repent. She promised to eliminate their heresy or their lives, whichever proved necessary. This wasn't the gentle shepherdess of popular imagination. This was a religious militant who saw the world in absolute terms: orthodoxy or death, France or England, God or Satan. There was no middle ground in Jean's universe, no room for the comfortable compromises that made civilization possible. By September, the army finally stood before the walls of Paris. The capital sprawled before them, the greatest city in Christendom. Jean wanted to attack immediately. Of course she did. Her voices demanded it. Her mission required it. But the Royal Council dragged its feet. Secret negotiations continued with Burgundy. Supplies somehow failed to arrive on schedule. When the attack finally came on September 8th, it was half-hearted at best. Jean led from the front as always, her white armour making her visible to all. She reached the very walls of the city, calling for ladders, calling for support that came too slowly, too reluctantly. Another wound found her, this time in the thigh. She'd been struck before at Orléans and risen to inspire victory. But this was different. As they carried her from the field, she must have sensed the truth. This wasn't a divine test to be overcome. This was failure, engineered and deliberate. The king ordered the retreat the next day. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a regrouping for another assault, a full retreat. The negotiations with Burgundy, Charles explained, were at a delicate stage. After Paris, everything changed. She was sidelined with surgical precision, given minor commands, sent to reduce insignificant fortresses while real decisions were made in chambers she could no longer enter. The king was always too busy to see her. The advisors spoke to her with the patient condescension reserved for children and madmen. By the spring of 1430, Jean had become what every revolutionary eventually becomes, an inconvenience to the revolution she'd enabled. The king had his crown. The negotiators had their opening. What use was a saint when what you needed was flexibility? She made one last attempt to matter. In May, she rushed to Compiègne, a town under siege by Burgundian forces. It was a minor action, but for Jean, it was a chance to prove she still had value. On May 23rd, she led a sortie against the Burgundian positions. It was vintage Jean, bold, direct, leading from the front. But wars are won by logistics, not heroism, and someone had miscalculated. Or perhaps calculated all too well. The sortie was outnumbered, overwhelmed. The French retreated toward Compiègne's walls, Jean protecting their withdrawal as she always did, last to leave the field. That's when it happened. The city's drawbridge rose while she was still outside. History debates whether it was tactical necessity or deliberate betrayal. The governor later claimed he had to raise the bridge to prevent the Burgundians from storming the gate. Critics noted how convenient it was, how perfectly timed to trap the one person Charles's court most wanted gone. Jean, isolated with a handful of men, fought until fighting became impossible. Surrounded, overwhelmed, she was pulled from her horse by an archer. The Maid of Orléans hit the muddy ground like any other defeated soldier. Word of her capture spread like wildfire. In the English camps, celebration. In the French court, a different reaction. The Archbishop of Reims was among the first to respond publicly. His letter to his diocese blamed Jean herself. Her pride, her refusal to listen to counsel, her willfulness. Not a word about ransom, not a suggestion of rescue, just immediate calculated distance. Charles VII's response was silence. He could have ransomed her, threatened retaliation, appealed to the Pope. He did nothing. The Archbishop of Embrun begged him to act. warning of indelible shame if Jean were abandoned. The letter received no recorded response, because the truth was that Jean dead was far more useful than Jean alive. Alive, she was a wild card, a religious fanatic who might disrupt delicate negotiations. Dead, preferably martyred, she could become a safe symbol, a rallying cry for future generations who would never have to deal with her uncomfortable presence. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 livres tournois. Nothing the French crown couldn't have matched if it had wanted to, but it didn't want to. The machine that had elevated Jeanne d'Arc had finished with her. Now it was time for the machine that would destroy her to begin its work. In Rouen, the English were preparing their own machinery. If the French machine had elevated and discarded her, the English one would dissect and destroy her. Both machines in their way would prove equally efficient. The room where they tried her was cold even in spring. The stone walls of the chapel in Rouen Castle sweating with Norman damp. 60 judges, assessors and clerks packed the space, their black robes making them look like a murder of crows gathered to pick at carrion. At the centre sat Bishop Pierre Cochon of Beauvais, a Burgundian partisan with personal reasons to hate the girl who'd upset the careful balance of power. He understood his real employers. This trial might be conducted in Latin, but it was bought with English gold. They brought Jean in wearing chains on her wrists, chains on her ankles, a great chain around her waist fastened to a wooden block. She was thinner than when they'd captured her. 9 months of imprisonment written in the hollows of her cheeks. But something in her bearing remained unbroken. The charges were a masterwork of legal creativity, heresy, for claiming direct communication with God without church mediation. Witchcraft, because her success against English arms could only be explained by diabolic assistance. Blasphemy, for wearing men's clothes in defiance of biblical injunction. And, most creatively, disturbing the peace of the church by refusing to submit her revelations to ecclesiastical authority. What they hadn't counted on was Jean herself. The trial transcripts capture something extraordinary. An illiterate peasant girl facing down the church's best theologians, and winning. When they asked if she was in God's grace, a trap question, since church doctrine held no one could be certain of salvation, she answered with elegant precision. If she was not in grace, she prayed God would put her there. If she was, she prayed he would keep her there. The matter of the men's clothing obsessed them. Day after day they returned to it. Her answers were consistently practical. She wore men's clothes for protection, for modesty among soldiers, because her voices commanded it. What she didn't say, what the records only hint at, was the darker reason. In her cell, guarded by English soldiers who saw her as both prize and plaything, women's clothing would have been an invitation. Bishop Cochon pressed hardest on the question of submission. Would she submit her visions to the judgment of the church? This was the heart of it. She made a distinction that was theologically sophisticated and politically fatal. She would submit to the church triumphant, God, and the saints in heaven. As for the church militant, the earthly institution represented by these black-robed men, she would honour it as far as her conscience allowed. But where it conflicted with her heavenly orders, heaven won. The trial dragged on for months. Every day brought new questions, new traps, new attempts to break her certainty. She met it all with a peasant's stubborn conviction and an intelligence that belied her lack of education. Her defences were so effective that several younger assessors began showing sympathy. One had to be expelled for suggesting the proceeding was invalid. Others found excuses to miss sessions. By May, Cochon was desperate. Something more was needed. On May 24th, they took her to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen. A scaffold had been erected, piled high with wood. Before a large crowd, they read out her crimes, painted her as a monster of heresy. Then they showed her what waited: the stake, the fire, the agony of burning. She broke, or seemed to. She signed something, made her mark rather, since she couldn't write. The official record claims it was a complete abjuration, renouncing her visions, accepting the church's authority, promising to wear women's clothes. Jean later claimed the document was much shorter, that they'd switched it. What's certain is that she made some form of submission, enough for Cochon to commute her sentence to life imprisonment. They took her back to her cell, the same cell with the same English guards, and there, someone made sure only men's clothes were available to her. For 3 days she held out, but modesty, dignity, and basic needs eventually won. She put on the doublet and hose. Cochon arrived within hours, satisfaction visible. She'd relapsed. In inquisitorial law, the sentence was automatic: death by fire. They dressed her in a white shift and a paper mitre inscribed with her crimes. The old marketplace of Rouen filled with people, soldiers, citizens, churchmen come to see their authority vindicated. The scaffold rose above them all, built high so everyone could see. They bound her to the stake with chains. The executioner Geoffroy Terrage built the pyre higher than usual, hoping smoke would take her before flame, a small mercy in a merciless proceeding. Through it all, Jean prayed. She asked for a cross. An English soldier made her one from 2 sticks, which she clutched to her chest. When a proper crucifix arrived, she begged the priest to hold it high where she could see it above the flames. He agreed, weeping openly. They lit the pyre. The smoke rose thick. The executioner's construction meant the flames took longer to reach her. Witnesses heard her crying out. Not recantations, not pleas for mercy. She called on her saints, on Jesus, on God himself. The crowd, which had come for spectacle, found something else. English soldiers wept. French citizens fell to their knees. One English soldier fled when he thought he saw a white dove flying from the flames. The executioner himself sought out a priest, convinced he'd damned himself forever. But the most telling reaction came from an English official. John Tressart, secretary to the English king, cried out, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." They burned her body 3 times, reducing it to ash to prevent any collection of relics. The ashes were thrown into the Seine, a final erasure. Nothing of her would remain. They were wrong about that too. Within 20 years, the French had driven the English from all their continental possessions save Calais. The King Jean had crowned, secure on his throne, ordered a new trial. The nullification trial of 1456 overturned her conviction, declaring the original trial fraudulent and Jean innocent of all charges. The machinery that had destroyed her had made a fundamental error. In trying to erase her, they'd immortalized her. The peasant girl who'd saved France became something more potent than any living person could be. A symbol, a rallying cry, a reproach to corrupt authority and cynical power. In trying to destroy her, they made her eternal. The smoke from the pyre in Rouen marketplace cleared long ago, but the questions it raised still linger in the air like incense at a requiem mass. What does it mean when a nation's saviour is also its sacrifice? What does it say about power when it must destroy what it most desperately needed? They made her a saint eventually, of course. In 1920, nearly 500 years after they burned her, the same church that had condemned her for heresy canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. The irony was lost on no one. The institution that had killed her for claiming direct communication with God now venerated her for claiming direct communication with God. But sanctification is just another kind of politics, isn't it? A safe way to honour the dead without confronting what their death reveals about the living. The real Jean, that fierce, complicated girl who heard voices and wielded swords, who could be both tender with wounded enemies and ruthless with heretics, disappears behind the guilt and incense. What remains is useful to everyone and challenging to no one. The French claim her as a patriot. Glossing over how French authorities engineered her downfall, the Church claims her as a saint, forgetting how Church authorities engineered her execution. Even the English in time would find ways to admire her courage while deploring her cause. Everyone got the Jean they needed. None of them got the Jean who was. But perhaps that's the ultimate tragedy of her story. Not that she was betrayed, not even that she was killed, but that she was transformed into exactly the kind of safe, manageable symbol she never was in life. The girl who refused to submit to anyone's authority but God's became an icon that every authority could claim. King Charles VII ruled for 30 more years after her death, his throne secured by her victories, his conscience apparently untroubled by her ashes. He became Charles the Victorious, credited with ending the 100 Years' War. History, written by the winners, forgot to mention that his greatest victory was won by a peasant girl he left to burn. And in Domremy, that little village on the Meuse where it all began, they exempted it from taxes in perpetuity in honour of their famous daughter. A nice gesture, really, much cheaper than a ransom would have been. But here's what haunts me about Jean's story. She was right. Not about everything, perhaps. Maybe not about the Hussites deserving death or God preferring French to English, but about the essential thing. The thing that made her dangerous. She was absolutely right. France could be saved. The English could be driven out. The impossible could be achieved if someone just believed hard enough to try. Every cynical politician who laughed at her, every practical commander who thought her mad, every careful diplomat who saw her as an obstacle, they were all wrong. She was right. The miracle was possible. It just required someone naive enough, brave enough, or crazy enough to attempt it. And that's the shadow she casts across history, longer and darker than any cathedral spire. In a world built on compromise and calculation, she proved that uncompromising belief could move mountains, or at least crown kings and lift sieges. No wonder they had to kill her. She was living proof that their entire system, the careful balance of power, the negotiated truces, the purchased loyalties, was built on sand. One teenage girl with absolute conviction had nearly brought it all tumbling down. Better to burn the carrier than risk the disease spreading. But sometimes, in the right light, you can still see her shadow. Every time someone stands up and says this is wrong when everyone else is being practical. Every time someone chooses certain death over comfortable betrayal. Every time the impossible happens because someone was too naive to know it couldn't. The machine that created her still exists, in different forms, with different names. It still needs its miracles when times are desperate enough. It still uses true believers to do its dirty work, and it still knows how to dispose of them when their usefulness ends. The machine that destroyed her exists too. It's gotten better at trials, more subtle in its condemnations. It doesn't burn bodies anymore. Too messy, too public. But it knows how to burn reputations, how to turn saints into pariahs, how to make problems disappear. Between these two machines, the miracle makers and the miracle breakers, people like Jean are still ground to powder. The only difference is we've gotten better at forgetting their names. But Jean, stubborn, impossible Jean ... refused to be forgotten. They burned her body, scattered her ashes, erased every physical trace, and still she rises, again and again, whenever someone needs to believe that the impossible is worth attempting. That's her real miracle, the one no trial could disprove, no fire could consume. She proved that sometimes the pure of heart can triumph over the clever of mind, that faith can move armies as surely as fear, that a nobody from nowhere can change the course of nations. In trying to destroy her, they made her eternal. In trying to silence her, they gave her a voice that speaks across centuries. In trying to reduce her to ash, they transformed her into light. That's the true judgment of history, delivered not by bishops in black robes, but by the countless ordinary people who found courage in her courage, faith in her faith, strength in her strength. The verdict of the centuries overturns the verdict of Rouen. Jeanne d'Arc was no heretic. She was hope incarnate, walking upright through a world bent double by compromise. And that's why she had to die. And that's why she'll never truly be dead. In the end, what was Jeanne d'Arc? A saint, a soldier, a madwoman, a political pawn. She was all of these and none of them. She was a mirror in which an age saw its own contradictions reflected back in flames. But to herself? To herself she was simply Jean, the girl who heard voices and obeyed them, who left her village because heaven demanded it, who crowned a king because her saints required it, who died in fire because betraying her voices would have been a worse death than any pyre could inflict. That simplicity was her strength and her doom. In a complex world she remained irreducibly simple. In a grey world she remained starkly black and white. In a world of angles she remained catastrophically straight. They broke her body but not her will. They stole her life but not her meaning. They won the battle but lost the war. The eternal war between those who see clearly and those who see cleverly. Between those who serve truth and those who serve power. Jean saw clearly. It killed her. But first, just for a moment, it lit up the whole world. And perhaps, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right across the fields of Domremy, you can still hear it. Not the voice of saints or angels, but the voice of a teenage girl who believed so hard it changed the world, who loved so fiercely it got her killed, who burned so brightly they had to put her out. In the morning they cast her ashes in the Seine. By evening she was already becoming legend. By the next century she was myth. By our time she's something else entirely. A reminder that the impossible is always possible. Right up until the moment they kill you for proving it. Sleep well, and remember, even saints cast shadows. Especially saints.